December 16, 1944. Just before dawn, in the cold hills of eastern Luxembourg, the men of the German 2nd Panzer Division moved toward a small village called Marnach. They were among the best soldiers Germany still had. Their tanks had been refitted in secret. Their crews were veterans. Their orders were to smash through a thin American line, cross the river beyond it, and reach the Meuse in a matter of days. The plan depended on speed, and speed depended on one assumption, that the Americans in front of them were finished. On paper, that assumption was correct. The American unit holding this stretch of ground had been pulled out of a forest 40 miles to the north only weeks earlier, and it had come out of that forest broken. It had lost nearly half its riflemen. Its companies had been rebuilt with green replacements, who had never heard a shot fired in anger. It had been sent to this quiet corner of the front for one reason: to rest. The German command knew all of this. They had chosen to strike here precisely because the line was held by tired men spread impossibly thin. And so the German colonel commanding that armoured thrust, a man named Meinrad von Laukert, expected Marnach to fall in an hour or two. What he got instead was something he could not explain. The handful of Americans in that village did not pull back. They did not surrender when surrounded. They fought from cellars and stone houses and ditches, against tanks, with almost nothing, and they kept fighting long after any reasonable soldier would have stopped. When von Laukert later described what his men had run into, he reached for a phrase that revealed his bewilderment. He said the Americans had defended the village foolhardily, with a defiance of death he had never encountered before. A defiance of death he had never encountered before. That sentence is the beginning of a mystery. Because the men in that village were not elite troops. They were not paratroopers. They were not hand-picked commandos. They were, for the most part, ordinary Americans from ordinary towns, citizen soldiers who, 3 years before, had been clerks and farmers and steelworkers and schoolteachers. They wore a small red patch on their left shoulder, a simple red shape that the soldiers themselves called the Keystone, and by the winter of 1944, that patch had earned the division that wore it one of the grimmest nicknames of the entire war. They were called the Bloody Bucket. This is the story of how they got that name. It is not a comfortable story, and it does not follow the usual shape of a war story. Because the name did not come from a great victory. It came from a place where these men were slaughtered. And the deepest question, the one this whole account is built around, is why men would carry a name born from their worst catastrophe, and wear it, decades later, with something that looks very much like pride. If this story moves you, a like genuinely helps it reach others who care about these men. And if you are new here, consider subscribing. Now, let us go back to the patch, and the name, and the truth behind both. The patch was a keystone. Not a bucket, a keystone. A simple 5-sided red shape, the heraldic symbol of the state of Pennsylvania, the Keystone State. The division was the Pennsylvania National Guard, and its roots ran deeper into American history than almost any other unit in the Army. Its earliest ancestors were the volunteer companies that Benjamin Franklin helped raise in colonial Philadelphia in the 1740s, men who armed themselves to defend their own streets. The modern division was organized in the 1870s and numbered the 28th during the First World War. In that earlier war, fighting in France in 1918, the division earned a different name. After the brutal battles around Château Thierry, General John Pershing himself is said to have called them Men of Iron, and the unit carried the title Iron Division for a generation afterward. By the time the Second World War came, the division was built around 3 infantry regiments, whose numbers would become a roll of honor over the months that followed: the 109th, the 110th, and the 112th. These were not anonymous formations stamped out by a wartime factory. They were rooted in specific Pennsylvania communities, in towns and city neighborhoods where the men of a single company often knew one another from civilian life, where a squad leader might have gone to school with the privates he now commanded. The division was called into federal service in February of 1941, almost a year before the United States entered the war. And then it trained and trained and trained. It moved from camp to camp across the country, from Pennsylvania to Virginia to Louisiana to the Carolinas, through amphibious schools and mountain exercises, learning its trade slowly, the way a peacetime army prepares when it senses the storm coming but has not yet been struck by it. So this was not some hastily assembled formation. This was an old division, a proud one, with a heritage measured in centuries rather than years, and the men who filled its ranks were citizen soldiers in the truest meaning of those words. They had stepped out of ordinary American life and pulled on a uniform, and most of them fully intended to step back into that life again the moment the job was finished. And yet that very heritage came with a quiet disadvantage, one that shadowed the division for much of the war. It was a National Guard outfit. In the culture of the wartime army, that label carried a faint condescension. Guard divisions were sometimes seen, fairly or not, as second tier, as collections of weekend soldiers who lacked the polish of the regular army. The 28th would spend the next year proving that judgment to be one of the cruelest mistakes anyone could make, because their ordinariness, the very thing that made them easy to underestimate, would turn out to be the hardest thing about them to break. Now, about the name itself, I want to be honest with you, because the honest version is more interesting than the legend. The popular story, the one repeated in countless books and on countless plaques, is that German soldiers gave the division its nickname. The story goes that the Germans looked at that red keystone on the shoulder and saw not a keystone at all, but a bucket spilling blood, and that they began calling the unit the Bloody Bucket, out of fear and respect for the savagery of its fighting. It is a vivid story. It may even be true. But here is what careful history actually shows. There is no surviving German document that records it. No captured order, no prisoner interrogation, no German war diary, no German memoir has ever been found that proves German soldiers coined that name. The earliest traceable source for the nickname is not German at all. It is American. It appears in the division's own wartime literature, where the men themselves told the story of the enemy fearing their blood-red patch. The Germans may well have used the name. Soldiers on every front gave grim nicknames to the enemies they dreaded. But as a matter of documented fact, the Bloody Bucket is a name the division wore and a name the division told stories about, more than it is a name we can prove came from the mouths of German troops. And that uncertainty, oddly, sharpens the real question rather than weakening it. Because whoever first said the words, the name stuck for a reason. It stuck because the blood was real. This division bled more than almost any American division in the entire war. So set aside the legend of who spoke the words first. The deeper truth is this: the Bloody Bucket earned its name in fact, if not in folklore. And to understand how, you have to understand three separate things, in order. You have to understand who these men were before the war found them. You have to understand what was done to them in a German forest in November of 1944, a forest that nearly erased the division from the rolls of the army. And you have to understand what those same broken, rebuilt, half-ruined men did 1 month later, when the German army came for them in the snow, and discovered that you cannot finish a unit simply by hurting it. Each layer goes deeper than the last, and the deepest layer is the one that explains the pride. So let us begin where the division's war truly began, not in a forest, and not in the snow, but on a beach, and in the streets of a liberated city. The men who would carry the Bloody Bucket name came ashore in Normandy on July 22, 1944, more than 6 weeks after the initial D-Day landings. They had trained for years, in Pennsylvania, in Virginia, in Louisiana, in the Carolinas, even in amphibious schools in Florida and the mountains of West Virginia. They had crossed the Atlantic in the autumn of 1943 and waited in Wales. By the time they finally entered the fight, the beachhead was secure, but the country beyond it was a killing ground of its own. That country was the bocage, the Norman hedgerow terrain, a landscape of small fields walled off by ancient earthen banks, topped with dense hedges. Every field was a fortress. Every lane was a potential ambush. The 28th fought through it in the brutal breakout battles of late July and early August, taking towns like Percy and Gathamo, learning the hard arithmetic of hedgerow combat, where a single machine gun could hold up a company and a few yards of ground could cost a dozen lives. This was their introduction to real war, and it was a merciless teacher. There were no clean battle lines in the bocage, only field after walled field, each one to be cleared at the cost of blood, with the enemy often invisible until the moment he opened fire. The men who survived those first weeks were no longer the parade ground soldiers who had trained in Louisiana. They had become veterans the only way an infantryman ever does, by burying friends and learning, very fast, what the difference was between caution that kept you alive and hesitation that got you killed. It was during this period that the division went through a wrenching change at the top, one that says a great deal about the savage randomness of that war. The division's commander, through its long training, had been a major general named Lloyd Brown. By the middle of August, the senior leadership of the army had concluded that Brown, though personally brave, was not the inspirational combat leader the division needed, and he was relieved. On August 13th, a new commander arrived to take over, a brigadier general named James Wharton. He assumed command of the division that day. Within hours, while visiting the front to see his new men, James Wharton was shot and killed by a German sniper. He had led the 28th Infantry Division for less than a single day, so on August 14th, command passed to the man whose name would become inseparable from the division's story. His name was Norman Cota, and the soldiers knew him as Dutch. He was already a legend before he ever set foot in the 28th. Cota was born in Chelsea, Massachusetts, in 1893. He had graduated from West Point in the famous class of 1917, alongside future generals who would shape the entire war. He was a friend of Dwight Eisenhower, and on the morning of D-Day, June 6, 1944, Norman Cota had done something that very few generals in history have done. He had landed in the assault waves on Omaha Beach, in person, under fire, as a senior officer of the 29th Infantry Division. On that beach, among the dead and the dying, and the men frozen behind the seawall, Cota had walked upright through the gunfire, organizing terrified soldiers, finding ways off the sand, personally helping to open one of the first exits from that murderous shore. He is remembered for rallying a group of rangers with a shout that became their motto, telling them to lead the way. For his courage that day, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest decorations the nation can give. This was the man who now took command of the Bloody Bucket. He was not a polished staff officer. He was a fighter who had stood on the worst beach of the war and refused to lie down. It is worth pausing on what a man like Cota was actually being asked to carry. A division commander in that war did not simply issue orders from a safe headquarters far behind the lines. He carried the weight of every decision that sent young men forward into fire. He had to obey plans handed down from above, sometimes plans he believed were poor, knowing that following them would cost lives, and knowing too that the line had to be held no matter the price. In the months just ahead, Cota would be ordered to attack into a forest he distrusted, and then ordered to hold a front he knew was far too long for his weakened division. He would obey both orders, because that obedience was the burden of his rank, and then he would watch the consequences fall on the men of the 28th. There are few harder things a soldier can be asked to do than to spend the lives of the men he commands, for objectives he did not choose, and to keep his nerves steady while doing it. Under Cota, the division pushed east as the German army in France collapsed. And then came the single brightest day in the division's entire war, a day so striking that it stands in almost unbearable contrast to what was coming. On August 29, 1944, the 28th Infantry Division marched through Paris. The city had just been liberated, and as part of both a celebration and a military movement toward the front, the division paraded straight down the Avenue des Champs Élysées, formed 24 men abreast, rifles on their shoulders, helmets gleaming, while crowds of Parisians wept and cheered and threw flowers. Generals reviewed them as they passed beneath the Arc de Triomphe. Photographs of that parade survive, and they are extraordinary. Rank after rank of American infantry, filling the width of the most famous avenue in Europe, marching in perfect order through a city drunk on freedom. For a few hours, these citizen soldiers from Pennsylvania were the very image of victory. And then the parade simply continued out the far side of the city, because the march down the Champs Élysées was not only a celebration, it was a road to the front. The men who had just been showered with flowers kept walking, out of Paris, toward Germany, toward the border, toward the war that was waiting for them. Within 2 weeks they had reached the German frontier itself, among the first Allied units to set foot on German soil. On September 12, 1944, the division began crossing the Aue River and assaulting the Siegfried Line, the belt of bunkers and dragon's teeth and pillboxes that guarded the German homeland. This was a different kind of fighting again. The German border defenses were not improvised hedgerows, but years of deliberate engineering, thick concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, rows of anti-tank obstacles, and minefields sown across every likely approach. To take such positions, infantry had to cross open ground swept by machine gun fire, get close enough to a bunker to blind it and breach it, and do all of this while German artillery fell among them. It was slow, costly, and intensely personal work, the kind of fighting where the courage of one man at the right moment could decide whether a whole attack lived or died. And it is here, in this fighting along the German border, that I want you to remember one man. His name was Francis Clark. He was a technical sergeant in Company K of the 109th Infantry Regiment, one of the division's 3 regiments. He was not a famous officer. He was an enlisted man from a small town in upstate New York, a place called Salem, near the Vermont border. Before the war, he had been a farmer and a factory worker. He had enlisted in the spring of 1942. On the surface, there was nothing to mark him out from 100,000 other sergeants in the army. But over a handful of days in the middle of September 1944, in the fighting along the Aue River and just inside Germany, near a place called Sevenig, Francis Clark would do things so far beyond ordinary courage that they would eventually place around his neck the highest award his country could give. We will come back to him, and to exactly what he did, later in this story. For now, simply hold his name, Francis Clark, the farmer from Salem, New York. Because his story, more than any speech or any statistic, is the answer to the question this whole account is asking. But Francis Clark's great moment came in September, and in the war of the 28th Infantry Division, September was the calm before the storm. Because to the east of where they stood lay a forest. On the maps it was called the Hürtgenwald, the Hürtgen Forest. And in that forest the division was about to walk into one of the worst defeats American arms suffered in the entire Second World War. To understand what happened in the Hürtgen Forest, you first have to understand the place itself, because the terrain was as much the enemy as the German army was. The Hürtgen was a dense, dark expanse of tall fir trees on the German border, broken by deep gorges, steep ridges, and fast streams. The trees grew so close together that daylight barely reached the forest floor. There were few roads, and the ones that existed were little more than muddy tracks. In autumn, the forest filled with cold rain, then sleet, then snow, and the ground turned to a sucking mud that swallowed boots and bogged down vehicles. It was, in short, a place that erased every advantage the American army had spent years building. The American way of war depended on movement, on artillery, on air power, on tanks ranging across open ground. None of it worked here. Aircraft could not see targets beneath the canopy. Tanks could not leave the few narrow trails without becoming trapped or exposing their thin belly armor. Artillery shells, instead of landing on the ground, burst in the treetops, raining down jagged splinters of wood and steel on the men below, so that even lying flat in a foxhole offered no safety unless you had logs over your head. The Germans, fighting on the defensive in prepared positions, held nearly every card. It is worth knowing that the 28th was not the only division fed into this forest. The fighting in the Hürtgen stretched across months and consumed one American division after another, becoming one of the longest single battles the United States Army has ever fought, and one of its costliest. Tens of thousands of American casualties were soaked up by those dark trees. The 28th's share of the tragedy was the attack toward Schmidt, and within that larger disaster, it would suffer the most concentrated blow of all. The 28th was ordered into this forest in late October. On October 26th, it relieved another American division, the 9th Infantry Division, which had already been badly chewed up trying to fight through the same ground. Cota was handed a plan by his superiors at the corps level, and it was a plan he disliked from the start. It required his 3 regiments to attack in different directions, towards separate objectives, spreading the division's strength across diverging axes instead of concentrating it. The main effort would drive toward a village called Schmidt, sitting on high ground beyond a deep gorge cut by the Kahl River. Cota later said he felt he had only a gambler's chance of succeeding. He was being asked to bet his division, and he knew the odds. The attack jumped off on November 2, 1944. At first, against expectations, it seemed to work. The 112th Infantry Regiment took the village of Vossenac on the ridge. Then it pushed down into the steep, wooded gorge of the Kahl, crossed the river at the bottom, climbed the far side, and on November 3rd captured Schmidt itself. For a moment, it looked like a triumph. American infantry stood on the objective, but they were at the end of a long, fragile thread, and that thread ran straight down the Kahl Gorge along a single narrow trail, and on that trail the entire battle would be lost. The Kahl Trail was the lifeline to the men in Schmidt. Everything had to come up it: ammunition, food, reinforcements, and above all, the tanks that the infantry desperately needed to hold the village against German armor. But the trail was a nightmare. It was narrow, it was cut into the side of a steep, rocky slope, it twisted through the trees, and in places it dropped away into the gorge on one side. The 30-ton Sherman tanks that tried to descend it slid, through their tracks, and became stuck, blocking the path behind them. Again and again the engineers tried to push armor down to Schmidt, and again the trail defeated them. The infantry in Schmidt were left almost alone, with little more than the weapons they carried. The Germans understood exactly what had happened, and they struck back with everything they had. Field Marshal Walter Model threw in a powerful counterattack, spearheaded by the tanks of the 116th Panzer Division and the infantry of the 89th Division and other units. German commanders later described their aim in blunt and chilling terms. They intended to cut off the Americans who had pushed across the Kahl and to destroy them where they stood. At dawn on November 4th, German tanks and infantry slammed into Schmidt. The American infantry, without armor of their own, without anti-tank guns in any number, fought as long as they could and then were overrun. Some men held, many were killed or captured. The survivors of Schmidt did not run far. They fell back only as far as the next village up the slope, a place called Kommerscheid, and there a small band of them turned and made another stand. They were joined at last by a handful of Sherman tanks that had somehow clawed their way down the murderous Kahl Trail to reach them. For several days, this thin force held Kommerscheid against German armor and infantry far stronger than itself, fighting off attack after attack in the freezing woods. It was a stand worthy of remembrance in its own right, but it could not last. When that position too became impossible, the order finally came to pull back, and the remnants were driven once more across the gorge, back down the deadly trail, back toward Vossenac, where the fighting became a savage close-range struggle through the ruins of the village. What followed was nearly 2 weeks of grinding horror. Vossenac changed hands in vicious fighting. Men fought from house to house and tree to tree. The cold deepened. The rain turned the forest into a swamp of freezing mud. Beyond the bullets and the shells, the forest itself was killing men, through exposure, through trench foot, through the simple physical toll of living in a flooded hole in the ground under constant bombardment. Soldiers cracked under the unending strain. The wounded often could not be evacuated because the trails were too dangerous and too clogged. It is hard, from a safe and comfortable distance, to truly grasp what those weeks did to a human being. Imagine living in a hole half filled with freezing water, day after day, never dry, never warm, never truly asleep. Imagine the trees above you bursting apart without warning, so that the safest-looking ground was in fact the most lethal. Imagine watching the men beside you, men you had trained alongside for years, killed by an enemy you frequently never even saw. The forest extracted a toll that no casualty list can fully capture, in minds as much as in bodies. More than 700 men in the division went down with trench foot alone. their feet ruined by the endless cold and wet, crippled without a single shot being fired at them. This was the place that filled the bucket, not some glorious open battlefield, but a cold, dark, drowning wood where a proud division was quietly taken apart, piece by piece, day by day. And in the middle of this nightmare came one of the most extraordinary and humane episodes of the entire war. Down in the Cal Gorge, near a small stone bridge over the river, the wounded of both sides lay where they had fallen, American and German together, unable to be reached. A German army doctor, a captain named Günther Stüttgen, helped arrange an unofficial truce, a pause in the killing, so that the wounded of both armies could be gathered and carried to safety. For several days in early November, in the midst of one of the war's worst battles, German and American medics worked the same ground under an informal flag of mercy. There is a memorial at that bridge today. It stands as a reminder that even in the deepest pit of that forest, something human survived. But mercy at the bridge could not change the outcome of the battle. By the time the division was finally pulled out of the Hürtgen Forest in the middle of November, the cost was staggering. In roughly 2 weeks of fighting, the 28th Infantry Division had suffered 6,184 casualties. Let that number settle for a moment. More than 6,000 men, killed, wounded, missing, captured, or struck down by the cold and the sickness of the forest, in about 2 weeks. That was close to 45% of the entire division. Some rifle companies, the men at the very tip of the spear, were effectively destroyed, reduced to a handful of survivors, led by whoever was left standing. The official historians of the United States Army would later describe the attack on Schmidt as one of the most costly division actions the American Army fought in the whole of the Second World War. The division's own history admitted, with painful honesty, that for all that blood, the division had accomplished very little. The ground gained was given up. The objective was lost. Today, the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest is taught at American military schools not as a model of success, but as a hard lesson in how terrain, weather, and a determined defender can swallow an army whole. One famous American general, James Gavin, who walked that ground after the fighting, would later call the decision to fight in the Hürtgen a ghastly mistake. So here is where we stand in the story. The proud old Iron Division, fresh from its glory parade through Paris, had been fed into a forest and torn nearly to pieces. Half its riflemen were gone. Its survivors were exhausted, traumatized, and grieving. By every measure the army used, this was a beaten division. If the name Bloody Bucket means anything in plain fact, it means this forest, where the blood was spilled in rivers and the bucket was filled to overflowing. And then, with the division gutted and its replacements raw and untested, the army sent the survivors to a quiet sector to recover. The place they were sent was a thinly held stretch of the front in the Ardennes region, along the Aar River, in Luxembourg. It was supposed to be a rest. It was, instead, almost the exact center of where the largest German offensive in the West was about to fall. By early December 1944, the 28th Infantry Division was strung out along a front of roughly 25 miles, an enormous distance for a single division to hold, and far too long for one that had just lost half its strength. The line was so thin that the strongpoints could not see one another. Between the villages held by American infantry lay long gaps covered by nothing more than patrols. The men dug in, took in their replacements, and tried to recover. The sector was so quiet that it had a nickname among the troops. They called it the Ghost Front. Almost nothing happened there. That was exactly the point. It was a place to heal. But on the other side of the lines, in total secrecy, the German army was assembling the striking force for Adolf Hitler's last great gamble in the West. Behind the trees, hidden from Allied aircraft by fog and careful discipline, 3 German armies massed for a surprise offensive aimed at splitting the Allied front, recapturing the vital port of Antwerp, and changing the course of the war. The spearhead aimed at the heart of the 28th Division's sector was the 5th Panzer Army, commanded by one of Germany's most capable generals, Hasso von Manteuffel. At the cutting edge of his army stood an armored corps under General Heinrich von Luttwitz, a corps that carried some of the most powerful units the German army still possessed in the West. It included the 2nd Panzer Division, the famous Panzer Lehr Division built around veteran tank crews, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. Their true objective lay well beyond the villages of the 28th. It was the road hub at Bastogne, where so many highways met, and beyond Bastogne, the open country that ran toward the Meuse River, and, the Germans dreamed, all the way to Antwerp. To reach it, they first had to ride straight over the tired men of the Keystone Division, and the German plan, like the German plan at Marnach, depended on speed. The panzers had to punch through the thin American line, seize the river crossings and the road network beyond, and race for the Meuse before the Americans could react. Everything depended on those first roads, and the most important road in the division's sector ran along a high ridge, a route the American soldiers had nicknamed Skyline Drive. Whoever held Skyline Drive controlled the movement of armies. Holding the center of that ridge, directly in the path of the main German thrust, was a single regiment of the 28th, the 110th Infantry, commanded by a tough, profane, experienced colonel named Hurley Fuller. Fuller had perhaps 2 battalions to cover a frontage of 9 to 11 miles, because his 2nd battalion was held back as the division reserve. He held it the only way it could be held, as a chain of fortified villages, each one a strong point, with open ground between them. His orders, when the storm broke, would be simple and merciless: hold at all costs. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, the storm broke. A massive German artillery barrage crashed down along the entire front. Out of the fog and the darkness came the German infantry and the German tanks. In numbers, the thin American line had no hope of stopping in the open. The German plan called for the panzers to be across the river and deep into the American rear by the end of the first day. It did not happen. And the reason it did not happen is the reason this story ends not in shame, but in honor. Because the broken, rebuilt, supposedly finished 28th Infantry Division did not break. The villages along Skyline Drive turned into a series of desperate last stands. At Marnach, the place where we began this story, the men of the 110th held against the elite 2nd Panzer Division until they were overwhelmed, and their defense so astonished the German commander that he called it a defiance of death he had never seen. At Hosingen, at Holzturm, at Weiler, at Munshausen, small groups of American infantry, many of them replacements who had been at the front for only days, fought from stone houses and church towers and roadblocks, and refused to yield the roads the Germans so desperately needed. The stand at Hosingen became something close to legend in its own right. A few hundred men, riflemen and engineers fighting side by side, held that village against assault after assault. From a tall water tower above the town, they could watch the German columns massing in the valleys, and they clung to their positions through the whole of the first day and on into the second. They held until they had almost nothing left to fight with. Only when their ammunition was genuinely gone, after nearly 2 full days that the German plan had never allowed for, were the surviving defenders finally forced to lay down their arms. The town had fallen, but every single hour they had bought was an hour stolen directly from the German advance, an hour that would later be counted in the survival of other men, miles away, who never knew their names. Every hour those villages held was an hour the German timetable slipped. Every road junction that an American squad blocked forced the panzer columns to stop, deploy, fight, and clear it before moving on. The Germans had counted on hours. The 28th made them spend days. The hardest fighting centered on a small Luxembourg town called Clairvaux, sitting in a deep valley with a medieval castle on a rock above it. Colonel Fuller set up his regimental command post in a hotel in the town. As the German tanks closed in, the defense of Clairvaux became a battle out of an older age. American soldiers, cut off and surrounded, fell back into the ancient stone castle and fought from its walls and windows, holding off German armor with rifles and a few light weapons. The town earned a name from those who remembered it. They called it the Alamo of the Ardennes. Fuller's command post in the hotel was finally overrun on the night of December 17th. Fuller himself escaped out a back window and into the dark, only to be captured by German troops the next day, December 18th. Clairvaux fell, but it had cost the Germans precious time they could never get back. This is the heart of the matter, and it is worth saying plainly. The 28th Infantry Division was wrecked in those days. The 110th Infantry Regiment was very nearly destroyed a second time, having already been bled white in the Hürtgen barely a month before. Colonel Fuller, after the war, recorded what his regiment had paid and what it had bought. The cost, he wrote, was the loss of around 2,750 of his officers and men. The result, he wrote, was the delay, by 3 crucial days, of the 2nd Panzer Division, the 116th Panzer Division, and another German division besides. 3 days. It does not sound like much. It was everything, because 40 miles to the west sat a crossroads town called Bastogne, a place where 7 roads met, a prize the Germans had to seize to keep their offensive rolling, and while the 28th Division was dying in its villages along Skyline Drive, buying those 3 days 1 farmhouse at a time, the American command was rushing reinforcements toward Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division and supporting armor raced for the town. They got there first, just barely, and held it through a legendary siege. But they only got there in time because someone else had slowed the German tide long enough for them to arrive. That someone was the bloody bucket. This is the cruel and beautiful logic of a delaying action, and it is worth understanding clearly, because it is the kind of sacrifice that history too often forgets. The men holding those Luxembourg villages were not going to win their battles. Most of them knew it. They were too few, too tired, and too lightly armed to stop a panzer army. Their job was not to win. Their job was to make the enemy pay for every road, every bridge, every crossroads, in hours and in casualties, and to keep paying until they could pay no more. A delaying action does not produce a triumphant charge or a captured flag. It produces a line of strong points that hold for an hour longer than they should have, and then fall, while far away, other men use that stolen hour to dig in. The defenders of Skyline Drive bought time they would never get to spend themselves. They spent it on others. After the battle, the cost and the meaning of that stand were not lost on the men who understood war. Colonel Fuller carried for the rest of his life a tribute from General Norman Cota, who told him that had it not been for his 110th Infantry, there never would have been a Bastogne. The Corps commander, General Troy Middleton, said much the same, that had Fuller's men not done the job they did, the airborne could not have reached Bastogne in time. Even the German commander, General von Manteuffel, the man whose offensive had been slowed, paid the division a soldier's compliment. He acknowledged that his forces had been met with tenacious and brave resistance, that the Americans had delayed him through skillfully fought combat, and that the river line he had needed to seize had not been reached on schedule at any point. Now think about what that means alongside the Hürtgen. 1 month earlier, the same division had been thrown into a forest and butchered for ground it could not hold, in a battle remembered as a disaster. And now that same division, half rebuilt with green men, strung impossibly thin, hit by the full weight of a German army, had performed one of the most important delaying actions of the war, and helped make the defense of Bastogne possible. The very brokenness that should have finished them had instead been spent, deliberately and bravely, to buy time at a price the Germans could not afford. And here, finally, the red keystone reveals its true meaning, a meaning far better than any legend about a bucket of blood. A keystone is not just a state symbol. In architecture, a keystone is the single wedge-shaped stone at the very top of an arch, the stone that locks all the others in place. Remove the keystone, and the entire arch collapses. Leave it, and the arch can bear enormous weight. Along that ridge in the Ardennes, the 28th Infantry Division was the keystone. It was the stone holding the arch. The Germans threw the weight of an entire offensive against it, trying to knock it loose and bring the whole American line crashing down. And the keystone held just long enough, cracked and bleeding, for the rest of the structure to be saved. Which brings us back to Francis Clark, the farmer from Salem, New York, the name I asked you to hold on to. Because the deeds of one quiet sergeant, told in full, explain the courage of the whole division better than any number ever could. Francis Clark's defining days came earlier, in the September fighting along the German border, before the forest and before the snow. They are worth telling slowly, because they show exactly the kind of man this division was made of. On September 12, 1944, near the village of Kalborn in Luxembourg, as the division crossed the Our River into the teeth of the Siegfried Line, Clark's unit ran into trouble. A platoon had pushed forward and become pinned down by heavy German fire, unable to move, in danger of being wiped out. Clark did not wait for orders. He went forward alone, crawling across open, fire-swept ground, to reach the trapped men. Under that fire he organized their withdrawal, and when a wounded soldier could not move, Clark went back for him and carried him to safety. He had crossed ground that should have killed him, and he had done it to bring other men out alive. 5 days later, on September 17th and into the 18th, near a place called Sevenig, just inside Germany, the fighting grew even worse, and Clark did something that moves beyond ordinary description. German machine gun positions were tearing his company apart. Clark went after them. Working forward by himself, again and again, he attacked those positions one at a time, knocking them out, exposing himself to fire that should have cut him down. When 2 platoons near him lost their leaders and began to falter, leaderless and in danger of collapse, Clark took command of both, steadied them, and kept them fighting. He was wounded. He refused to be evacuated. He stayed in the fight, leading men who were not even his to lead, until the position was secure. For those days of almost unimaginable courage, Technical Sergeant Francis Clark received the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration the United States can bestow. He was the only man in the entire 28th Infantry Division to earn it in the Second World War. President Truman placed it around his neck in August of 1945, and then Francis Clark did the most telling thing of all. He went home. He returned to Salem, New York, to the ordinary life he had left, and he lived quietly for decades, a farmer and a working man, until his death in 1981. He is buried in the town where he was raised. Picture for a moment what a German intelligence officer would have made of Francis Clark if he had studied him. He would have found no aristocrat, no career soldier, no member of a warrior caste. He would have found a farmer from a small town who had been a civilian 3 years earlier, an enlisted man, a sergeant, the kind of soldier the German army filed under the heading of common infantry. And that ordinary man had crawled through machine gun fire to save strangers, had destroyed enemy positions single-handedly, and had taken command of leaderless troops in the middle of a collapsing fight. Multiply Francis Clark by the thousands of men in that division who did smaller versions of the same thing, in the forest and in the snow, and you begin to understand the defiance of death that so baffled the colonel at Marnach. But understanding the courage means also facing the cost, honestly, without looking away. Because the name Bloody Bucket was paid for in full, and the bill was enormous. Across its time in combat in Europe, the 28th Infantry Division fought for 196 days. In that time it suffered 16,762 battle casualties. That figure is larger than the division's own fighting strength at full establishment. It means that the division, in effect, was bled out and rebuilt more than once over, that the men who marched down the Champs Élysées and the men who finished the war were in large part not the same men at all, because so many of the first had fallen and been replaced. There is a particular sorrow buried in that arithmetic, and it belongs to the replacements. The system that kept the division alive worked by feeding new men into it a few at a time, individuals plucked from training and shipped forward to fill the gaps that combat tore open. A replacement often arrived at the front alone, a stranger, sent up to a squad of veterans in the dark, not knowing the men around him and not known by them. Many of these young soldiers were killed or wounded within days, sometimes within hours, before anyone in the unit had even learned their names. They never appeared in a famous photograph. They never marched in a parade. They simply arrived, took their place in the line because the line had to be filled, and were gone. The casualty figure for the 28th is not an abstraction. It is thousands of such individual arrivals and departures, each one a young man with a home somewhere, stacked one upon another across 196 days of combat. Behind that number are individual stories that the records can only hint at. There were the riflemen lost in the treetop bursts of the Hürtgen, men killed by splinters of their own shattered forest. There were the soldiers of the 110th who held their villages in the Ardennes until they were surrounded and could hold no more. There was Colonel Fuller, going into long months of captivity. There were the green replacements who arrived in December with only days of frontline life behind them, and who, against every expectation, stood and fought beside the veterans, and died beside them too. Each of those losses was a town in Pennsylvania or New York or anywhere in America receiving the worst news it would ever get. The blood in the name was not a metaphor. It belonged to specific men with specific names and specific homes, and yet the division was not destroyed. It was hurt almost beyond belief, and it kept fighting. After the Ardennes, the survivors were pulled back, rebuilt once more with fresh men and replenished equipment, and committed yet again, because that is what was asked of it, over and over, until the war was won. In the early weeks of 1945, the 28th fought to help reduce the Colmar Pocket, a stubborn German bridgehead west of the Rhine in the Alsace region, this time serving under the command of the French First Army. Its 109th Infantry Regiment entered the city of Colmar in early February 1945. From there, the division pushed on, crossed the Rhine into the heart of Germany, and drove deeper into the collapsing Reich in the final weeks of the war, fighting on until the German surrender finally brought the long killing to an end. Think about that pattern for a moment, because it is the truest measure of the division's spirit. Most units, after a catastrophe on the scale of the Hürtgen, would have been considered spent. After the second catastrophe in the Ardennes, almost any army in the world would have written the formation off entirely and broken up its survivors to fill other ranks. Instead, the 28th was rebuilt and sent back into action a third time, and a fourth, and it fought to the very end. The men changed. The faces in the photographs were not the same from one season to the next, but the division endured, carrying its red keystone forward through one bloodletting after another, and never once breaking under the weight. When the war in Europe was over, the men of the Bloody Bucket had earned a record that few divisions could match, written in casualty lists rather than in headlines. They had been credited with 5 separate campaigns across the long road from Normandy to central Germany. They had stood in the line for 196 days of combat, a punishing total that left them among the most heavily engaged American divisions of the entire war. 1 Medal of Honor, won by a farmer from New York. Hundreds of lesser decorations for valor, a reputation, among the men who had fought beside them and the men who had fought against them, that no amount of pre-war condescension about weekend soldiers could ever touch again. The division was inactivated from federal service at the end of 1945, its surviving men sent home to the lives they had set down years before. So now let us return to where we started, to the German side of the line, and ask what they finally understood about the men in front of them. The German command had built its great Ardennes offensive on an assumption, the same assumption von Lauchert carried toward Marnach, that a division which had been hurt as badly as the 28th had been hurt could not fight. They believed they were striking a hollow shell. They were wrong, and the error cost them the timetable on which their entire gamble depended. The men they had written off held the villages, blocked the roads, and bled away the precious days the Germans needed to win. By the time the panzers fought their way through that thin red keystone of a line, the moment had already passed, and Bastogne stood in their path, defended. What the Germans never managed to grasp, and what the legend of the Bloody Bucket clumsily reaches for, is a truth about this particular kind of army. The 28th was not made of supermen. It was made of ordinary citizens, drawn from farms and factories and shops, men who would much rather have been home. There was nothing in their background that promised the defiance of death the German colonel described, and that is exactly what made them so hard to finish. You can destroy an elite formation by killing its irreplaceable specialists. But how do you destroy a division that is simply a cross-section of a free country that rebuilds itself out of more ordinary men each time it is shattered, and fights just as hard the next time? You can fill the bucket with their blood, again and again. You cannot make them quit. That is the real meaning of the name. Strip away the uncertain legend about who first spoke the words, and what remains is solid and true. The Bloody Bucket was a name a division earned by being broken and refusing to stay broken. It was a name written in a forest where they were slaughtered for nothing, and redeemed in the snow where they were slaughtered for everything. The blood was real, the bucket was full, and the men who carried the name to the end carried it not as a mark of shame, but as proof of the one thing the enemy could never take from them. There is a tribute, broadcast not long after the Ardennes fighting, that captures it as well as anything ever has. An American correspondent named Morley Cassidy told his listeners that the 28th Division had performed one of the greatest feats in the history of the American Army, that against the weight of multiple German divisions, it had held so firmly that the German timetable had been thrown completely off. He was speaking of the same men who, 1 month earlier, had walked out of the Hürtgen Forest as the survivors of a defeat. Both things were true. The defeat and the feat were the same division. That is the paradox at the center of the Bloody Bucket, and it is the reason the name endures. The red keystone still exists. It is still worn today on the shoulders of soldiers in the Pennsylvania National Guard, the oldest division-sized unit in the entire United States Army, its lineage running back through that frozen ridge in the Ardennes, through the dark forest on the German border, through the flowers of the Champs Élysées, all the way to the men Benjamin Franklin armed in colonial Philadelphia. When a soldier of that division looks down at the keystone on a sleeve, the meaning is not a bucket and it is not blood. The meaning is the stone that holds the arch, the one that takes the full weight and does not give way. Thank you for spending these minutes with the men of the 28th Infantry Division. They were not the most famous division of the war. They did not get the films and the songs, but they bled more than almost anyone, in places most people have never heard of, and they held lines that had to be held by someone, and they held them. If this story reached you, a like is the simplest way to help it find others who care about this history. If you are not yet subscribed, this is a good moment, and turning on the bell means you will not miss the next one. I would like to know where you are watching from today, so tell me in the comments. And if someone in your own family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, a neighbor whose stories you grew up hearing, tell me about them below. Tell me their name. So many of those men came home and never spoke of what they did, and never asked to be remembered. Remembering them now, in our own small way, is the very least we can do.